as a flesh wound. It's alive! You can't handle the truth.
Go ahead. Make my day.
Say all right, all right, all right.
Always live in awe of the glorious mechanism of the human body.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Soft Tissue Podcast. My name is Jordan, the Soft Tissue OT, and today we are joined by a very special guest, Brian Carroll. And for those of you who are not aware of Brian, if you've been living under a rock for the past couple of years, then Brian has a great story and background to it, and really excited to have him for this podcast episode. So thank you very much for joining us, Brian. And to give a bit of a bio into it, Brian is a retired world-class powerlifter with over 2 decades of professional powerlifting. From 1999 to 2020, Brian Carroll was a competitive powerlifter and one of the most accomplished lifters in the sport's history, in which he squatted a mind-boggling 1,000 pounds or more 60 times officially. Incredible. Brian realized many ups and downs during his 20-plus years competing, but his journey took a sharp turn when he sustained an injury and developed significant low back pain. After many years of dealing with his low back injuries and failed therapy, Brian met with the world-renowned back specialist and previous guest on this podcast, Professor Stuart McGill, back in 2013, which changed his trajectory on both his life and powerlifting career. Brian and Stuart McGill worked together to recover from his low back injuries and to make a triumphant return to the professional powerlifting arena, in which Brian set an all-time squat record of 1,306 pound squat. Just incredible. Brian is also an accomplished author of several books, including one of my recent favorites, which I've got right there. Nice little plug for you, Brian, there, in terms of Gift of Injury, which he co-authored with Stuart McGill. And he's also the founder of Power Rack Strength and a fellow McGill certified practitioner, much like myself. And currently he assists numerous people with rehabilitating their back injuries, including top athletes from around the world. So without further ado, welcome, Brian.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, and looking forward to discussing all these different things that you mentioned. It sounds interesting just hearing you kind of summarize some of these things, because I've been living it. So sometimes you take a step back and wonder where the time has been, or where it's went. 20 years competing, it's like just a blur, a flash. But I'm glad to be here, and let's have a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much for your time. And with that, as you said, over a 20-year career, let's start there. When did you first get into powerlifting? What did that sort of change come about? How did you first get into the area of powerlifting?
I was traveling with a friend that did Fire and Police Olympics, where they had bench press and deadlifting. So I was traveling to a competition with a friend, and I saw that there were some younger kids competing, and so I just jumped in the competition in May. I think it was May of 1999. And I jumped in and got second place and kind of got hooked. It was bench only, raw. It was actually on the beach under a tent on the Gulf of Mexico in Tampa. And I just got hooked with everything about it. I played baseball at a decent level for a long time, and it was kind of time for me to decide if I wanted to try to play at a community college. I wasn't going to go to any university to play because I wasn't that good, but I was good enough to play at the next level. And I had a fork in the road. After I competed a couple times in bench press, I realized that's what I wanted to pursue in some way. I didn't know that I wanted to powerlift for 20 years, but I knew that baseball was ending. It was time to go to the next thing. And I basically just fell in love with it in 99 and really got serious in 2000, 1, 2, and 3, and then really got bit by the bug in 03 and really never turned back since then. Did a little bodybuilding during that time, but once I got really hooked, I never went back to bodybuilding.
Yeah, fascinating. And again, insights from reading from your book. It was quite interesting to see how you gained a lot of success early in your career. And I mean, not to generalize, but typically powerlifters, which we'll get into down the track as we talk a little bit more specifics, but powerlifters, take years and years and years to develop the bone, right? They're hardening the bone and all the rest of it. So it's quite interesting that you managed to reach a high level quite soon.
Yeah, I did. I had some genetic gifts as far as my configurations. I was pretty strong, just kind of naturally. I was quick and strong in some ways. I was benching 315 at 16, so that's not like freak status, but it's pretty strong. I I mean, I knew some guys that are top lifters now or were in the last couple of decades that they're benching 315 at like seventh or eighth grade. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? Middle school, junior high. But so I was benching that, and when I was 16, 11th grade, and I definitely gravitated towards the squat pretty quickly. Had a lot of a natural ability, but I never knew about how long it took bone to adapt. I did train relatively smart, but all that mattered to me was getting to the next level, lifting more weight. And I didn't care about the consequences because I never planned on living past 30 or 40. And 30 came up and I was like, oh wow, I made it. Let's compete some more. And so I ended up competing till I was about 40. But during this time, I never planned on my life, my second phase of my life after 40. But the next thing you know, I have kids at 39, squat the all-time record, and just realized, this phase can't last forever, and it's time to move on to the next thing and help as many people as I can. It just got to be one of those things that I just kind of grew out of the competing and all the drugs and supplements and the day in and day out. I said this recently on another discussion I had with somebody. A lot of the NFL football players that I've talked to, and the coaches, the strength coaches, because I know some of those guys, and they told me, because a lot of these coaches also played in the NFL, and they told me that the hard part isn't showing up for practice. It isn't Sunday dressing out for the game and going and doing that. The hard part is the behind the scenes, the rehab, the therapy, the mental, the studying in the classroom, learning the playbook. He goes, that's what weeds people out after a while. It isn't that they just can't physically do it. It's everything they have to do to get physically and mentally ready, and then they're done. And that, I kind of relate to that a little bit with powerlifting, because I had to do so much, worry about my recovery and my training and my other parts of my life. And it got to be so much work for me that I didn't enjoy it anymore. So it was time to move on.
Right. And it's as you said, when you're reaching that upper caliber, it's literally takes up all consuming, right? It takes up everything you're doing is focusing on that goal. As you're saying, eating, scheduling, sleep, all that rehab coming into it. And obviously it's quite well spoken about nowadays, but LeBron James is a great example. The millions that he spends on recovery and rehab each year. And obviously, we're not fortunate enough. Everyone doesn't have a spare million in our pocket to spend just on rehab like he may have. But it just shows how invested he is. And that's why, obviously, he's had such a long career, or partly why he's had such a long career. But do you think that I guess, the tunnel vision that you had to have to achieve and go for those, high level of lifting and what you're putting your body through, is that sort of why you phrased it as said, not living past 40? You were just concentrating solely on that task?
Yeah, and I just couldn't see it. I just couldn't see myself being an older man or older guy and not competing at, beyond 40. So it didn't matter to me either. So it was tunnel vision. It was also just not caring, like what was next. It's only about right now. And then I probably won't even make it to 40 anyway. Yeah,
wow. Interesting. And so, as we were discussing there, when you first started out, I believe your first encounter with, and I'll call it, and I apologize if it's a bit lessening, but your first encounter with back pain being a little bit less significant, and that happened around baseball in high school. Is that correct?
Yeah, running stadiums. So I was like kicking ass, running up so you have the small steps where the people would walk, right, to get their seat in the stadium. But then you have the bigger steps where you'd actually sit on, right? So we would run the bigger steps and the smaller steps. One time while running the bigger steps, I just felt like my back just didn't feel good. And it bothered me for about 6 months off and on. And then it just, like a lot of the times with people that we talk to or see, it's episodic, and then they're fine for the next years. Sometimes it never comes back. And yeah, that was my first time I felt back pain, and it really affected my baseball a lot. And that was brutal.
Yeah. And then from there, so to reframe, so 1996, I believe that was roughly about. How old were you then?
I was about 15.
Okay. And then your first more significant back injury. Take us through that. That was roughly around 2009, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I was actually trying out for a police academy scholarship, and it was a humid July morning, and I was trying to, get the scholarship. So I was hustling. and it was humid, and I was hopping over a barricade, and as I was hopping over it, I slipped up and landed right on my butt, and yeah, that set me back for a little bit for sure. And I didn't know that I broke something. I definitely knew that I jarred something, that my back locked up on me. So I literally just kind of limped back to my truck and then laid around in the parking lot for as long as I, had to before I could get up and get in my truck and drive home. But that's definitely what destabilized me and started the cascade for sure, because that was the first time during my powerlifting days where I felt like, okay, like something's wrong with my back.
Wow. Yeah, right. And then from that, following on, you went on a little bit short, very short amount of time. You went on to go and squat 1,185 pounds. And was that when you started to realize, okay, this is getting more and more significant?
Yeah, I squatted that all-time world record at 275, and my back started going downhill from that point. 2011, 2012. And yeah, then I started seeing specialists in 2013, and man, it started to become pretty difficult.
And on that, so firstly, take us through which specialists you saw, and then what did they sort of say? What was their, I guess, treatment plan for you at that stage?
So I talked to two orthopedic surgeons that said, we'll do a fusion on you, and that wasn't going to be helpful. And then one neurosurgeon was going to do a microdiscectomy, but I had so much damage. I had multiple levels of in-plate damage, and my sacrum was split, and my discs were basically, I had no height left in my discs, so they're compressed and smashed pretty much, and some bulges, whatever fragments or whatever disc I had were basically bulging. So they wanted to do some procedures on me, but looking back, it really wouldn't have helped me, because they didn't know. No one tried to address the cause of my pain, my poor movement patterns. Needed to take some time off from training. Needed to re-strategize my core work, so on and so forth. And yeah, they basically didn't have a good answer for me. And physical therapy, unfortunately, is just cookie cutter. So that's not usually going to make someone feel better, especially if they have multiple pain generators on different levels, and in-plate damage and disc bulges and listhesis and all kinds of different things.
And it's a fascinating thing to, again, knowing a little bit more about your story and reading the book, which I highly recommend to anybody out there. It's a fantastic read and a great insight. And when I was speaking to Professor McGill, and he was also blown away, which I can truly support his point of view in terms of fantastic writing from your end. I mean, especially, we'll talk a little bit more about it, but going through and actually, explaining that whole scenario from the beginning and where you were, and I mean, at your lowest point going through. And with that, at chapter 1, it was, you're sitting there in your car in the parking lot, and I believe it was after seeing some of the specialists, and you hit your sort of rock bottom. Can you sort of, without going too much into detail, but take us back to that time? What was that like for you, with being told that, okay, we need the fusions, not going to be able to lift, etc.?
Yeah, it was frustrating, because nobody was giving me like a chance to feel better. There's you're done lifting. It was always we'll see in a couple months, without any good direction. So I got really frustrated on the way back to my car from the neurosurgeon. And yeah, I considered for a couple minutes just kind of ending it. I never put the gun to my head or anything, but I looked at it, and I, may have had it in my hand, but I just, I thought quickly that, man, this would be an out. But then also better thoughts prevailed, and I realized this would be a really unwise move, and overreacting quite a bit. I realized that it was overreacting quite a bit. And I've had a lot of people tell me that they've been in that same situation. A lot of clients, a lot of just passerbys that have read the book. Hey, man, like, you getting a bad report or multiple bad reports and going back to your car and considering A, B, or C is exactly what I did. And so when I read your book, you immediately hooked me into understanding, okay, well, what happened with this guy? How did he beat this? So yeah, it's not necessarily what I wanted to talk about, but it was part of the process. So it was true. It's real. And a lot of people face this when they're being quote unquote robbed of their athleticism, robbed of their happiness, Their outlet is being taken away, the lifting, even if they're not like a top echelon lifter. I don't know about you, but most of the people that I work with that are back injured or back pained, they're not, some are top athletes, some are very good at what they do. Some are just average Joes that really screwed their back up because they got a coach that said, you need a deadlift or you need to do this. And they just destroy their spine, not even trying to push the limits on strength. And so I work with a lot of people that are like that suddenly can't play with their kids. They can't go to work. All they can do is lie on their side, And so it isn't just the upper echelon lifters. It's a lot of average Joes that I work with that once their happiness is robbed and they can't have an outlet, they can't play with their kids, they can't sit down, they can't have sex with their wife, they consider the out, of taking their life because, back pain really gets to people and it's pretty miserable.
Oh, absolutely. And I think as we were talking there, it was really sort of speaking what I tell a lot of my patients and talk to them about is that you can't not use your spine, right? And that's, I think, one of the challenges when you're dealing with low back issues and low back pain. You fracture your arm or you fracture your leg, you're in a cast and you've got crutches and you can take the weight off of it and do the right thing. And that, people can see from the outside as well that you're injured. When we can't see the spine, you can't tell that somebody's got back pain by just looking at them standing still, right? And so you can't actually see the injury itself. And I think sometimes that makes it a little bit challenging for both the person with back pain, but also, those around them, because you might present fine in terms of from the outside, but nobody knows what you're dealing with inside. And that's where it can become so consuming, as you said, in everything we do. Simple things, tying shoes, right? Going for a walk, if that might be too much for a person at a time, or as you said, playing with the young ones. And I think with that, it links in again to that identity as well. And as you were saying before, in your case scenario, how powerlifting was your be all and end all, as we said, that tunnel vision, and almost having that, taken away from you, and that impact that can have. And you're not alone in terms of the, I guess, ramifications of that. We hear it, unfortunately, very commonly in our clinic where patients do, they consider, it might be an easy option just to end it all.
Yeah. And I've talked to a lot of people that, unfortunately they're at that breaking point. And I always, you have to approach each person differently. But a lot of the times these people have issues that they haven't dealt with. And I was one of those people, most likely. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I started off as a massage therapist, okay? So going back to 2002. So even before I got into any of this back stuff, I still worked with backs because I was a massage therapist, right? But even more than that, is you end up being someone's therapist when you're a massage therapist. They tell you about what they have going on, what's going on in their neighborhood, what's going on with their husband or wife. Just like a hair cutter or a stylist, a bunch of stuff you don't necessarily want to hear, nor is it part of your job description, but they still are giving you this stuff. So I got used to hearing of people's problems. And one thing that I noticed with people, these training addicts is what I call them, people that are addicted to training. And that's a lot of people that you probably see. And it's certainly a lot of people that I see. These people have their demons. And if they're not exercising, those demons are working them over in the mind. So they have destroyed their body in the name of being okay with themselves. And a lot of the times those type of people will need further psychological counseling to help them parse through these different traumas in their life or complexes or whatever they're dealing with. So, man, a lot of the time they do need to sit down with someone and talk. Now, I do talk with a lot of people and we won't even workshop a lot of the time. No one actually listens to the client. They don't have an hour to sit down and say, where have you been? Where do you want to go? Where are you at currently? And that's what a lot of my coaching is just sitting down and listening to someone and having the empathy of having been there, but understanding what the root of the problem is. And it may be their childhood, or maybe they didn't play well in sports when they're young and they're trying to make up for it now. So the bottom line is most people don't get better is because the specialists or the surgeons or the coaches, there's no billing code for counseling. And they're not going to sit down and talk with Jordan for an hour and say, okay, we know you have some damage on the MRI, but you're not your MRI. What do you do for work? What are you trying to do? What are your goals? What can you do pain-free? What can't you do pain-free? And then let's hash this out for the next hour or so. And I never had that. So that's my mission now, is to sit down and talk with people. And we do have to refer out to psychological counseling and such, but man, it's so rampant across the world with people just not getting good care. I'm glad I met Dr. McGill 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very, very similar here, unfortunately, in terms of you go see a specialist and they'll maybe spend 15 minutes with you. And we sometimes joke, you just get to see the top of their head, right? Because they're down looking at the computer, looking at the scans, and they don't even look up to sort of, actually get to know the person. And it really is, it takes also that perspective shift. And I'm sure you're pretty similar, but I get a lot of patients that walk in and, sit down and say, okay, what brings you in? And then they go, okay, I've got an L5-S1 disc bulge. And I said, well, what brings you in? What is that impacting on your life? How is that, causing issues? Tell me about that. I'm not so concerned right now, the anatomical diagnosis. And yes, we'll look at the scans and all that sort of stuff once we've done a thorough assessment. But why are you here? And they're blown away. They're sort of, I've never been asked that, right? And it's because, as you said, the specialist or the GP doesn't have time, so they'll just write you up a script. Here you go, try this. And if it doesn't work, go somewhere else.
Yeah, it's rough. At best, they'll get a cookie cutter that may land on the wall 1 out of 10 times or something like that, but it's only temporary and they don't know why it works or how it worked. So it's a broken system. It's severely broken, especially when it comes to back injury and back surgery and back rehab. And it's super broken, and that's why the world needs people like you and me to continue to help as many people as possible and actually spend time with the client, not treat them like an MRI scan. You have some people, as they might have the worst MRI scans you ever seen. I had a strongman that reached out to me earlier this week. This guy had so much damage on every level from T12 to S1 that you would think that this guy would be writhing in pain with everything he did. I'm talking facet, arthritis, hypertrophy, cysts, discs flatten, lateral disc bulges, annular tears, you name it, on 6 different levels, right?
Wow. So
sit down with him. He has some retrolesthesis, some spondylolisthesis. Surgeon's like, man, this is bad. We need to get you in here for a fusion. And so I sit down and talk with him. And how do you feel right now? I'm fine. I quit lifting 3 weeks ago and I feel good. Oh my God. Do not go get the spine fusion. Of course, I didn't say that right away, but that's what I wanted to tell him. Had to go through the checklist. What causes your pain? Okay. Bending, twisting, extending. Okay, that makes sense. What can you do pain-free? Well, I can walk, I can stand, I can sit, I can lie down. Oh my God, do not get surgery. You know what I mean? Like, don't. Even though your MRI and the radiology report is a death sentence, quote unquote, you're not your MRI, man. Do not go get that surgery. So after 2 hours with them, I had his confidence up. He wasn't sentenced to a death by rehab for the rest of his life or death by surgery. And he's doing well.
Yeah, fascinating. Brilliant. And I think, again, if people just take the time, right, rather than, oh, look at the scan. Okay, yes, quick stat, let's get you off to surgery. As you said before, take the actual time to get to know the person's story, get to know what's going on with them. And as you nicely put it, we're not our scans, right? We're not our MRI scans. And sure, again, I could talk about it for hours, but we spoke about it with Professor McGill in terms of what we term pathology versus morphology, right? We're going to see some changes occur, and especially if we're dealing with a strongman or powerlifter who has been putting some heavy weight on the spine, you're going to see some adaptation take place. And so again, the scan can't tell you whether that's a pain generator or whether it's a sensitive tissue. It can just tell you that it's quote unquote changed compared to what the norm is, even though norm is, again, a very interesting term, but it's fascinating. And so on that point, speaking of scans, it's really quite interesting to see your scan that you put in the gift of injury there. So with that, from an anatomical point of view, and again, we're going to put it in context and we'll talk about all the other stuff as well, but from an anatomical point of view, can you briefly describe the injuries that you sustained in the spine?
Yeah, so I had L4, L5. The disc was pretty much flattened, and whatever was left was bulging. L5, S1, the disc was flattened and bulging. But I had most concerning to Dr. McGill was the fracture that I had in my vertebral body of the sacrum. And that was, that's the base of my spine. That's the foundation. And he was very concerned about that. And that's what we focused on going forward after the assessment, was healing up that fracture and letting the bone be able to handle load once again, being able to, but we had to slowly build that up with the bone callousing strategy that was experimental at the time, where we could talk about that now if you'd like.
Yeah, let's dive into it. Yeah.
So basically, he told me that you need to heal this bone, and after you're pain-free, you need to load it every 5 days and let it rest. So we started off with goblet squats, suitcase carries, different things like that, no barbell work for a bit. And then slowly, as my back desensitized and began to bear load without pain, I slowly, over that 18 months, started off with very light load, and then every 5 days or once a week, I'd load it up, let it rest, and basically it creates a scaffold of bone. Every time you stimulate it, it attracts ions and minerals to lay the bone down. You rest for 5 days, and you slowly create micro trauma, which helps it heal. But if you do too much, you don't want that macro trauma where you end up going backwards, more sensitivity, more damage that runs ahead of the rate of repair, and then you end up having a fracture like I did. But that was the big focus of Dr. McGill, was that fracture. He said it looked like someone took a hatchet to my sacral body, S1 there, and split it. And he was not very optimistic about my chances to get back under the bar, to lift heavy and remain resilient.
Wow. Yeah. And it's again, the scan itself, shows exactly what you're describing, literally the sacrum being split in half. Quite incredible with that. And it goes back to, the tipping point, as you're saying, both in terms of before an injury, respecting the tipping point, but then also if you develop an injury, having that awareness, as you said, taking the time off to actually allow that adaptation to take place. So we don't want to overdo it, but you still need to stimulate it enough to get the change going through. And that's, as you'll know, it's not an easy thing to do, have that self-control, especially for somebody who, has been squatting as heavy as you have, to, I guess, put that ego in check and be okay with saying, okay, this is what it takes for now. It's not going to be forever, but this is what I need to do. And having that restraint. But, as the saying goes, the proof's in the pudding.
Athletes can be difficult to deal with, especially when you're telling them to take time off. What I had to do, and this was a little bit of a mental game for myself, was take time off and put the same effort that I do into the world records that I hit. I'd hit 2 all-time world records previously. 2006, 1030 at 220, 2011, 1185 at 275. That same focus to everything that I did to accomplish those, I had to reconfigure in my brain how to take that same amount of effort and focus and put it into my rehab and whatever I needed to do. So the same thing that helped me push forward also helped me pull back and stay disciplined and never break protocol. And that's one thing I never did. No matter what was said to me in the gym, I'm doing bird dogs on the ground while everyone's squatting and deadlifting and benching. I never let it pull me off my trajectory, no matter what. I just stayed in my lane, stayed patient, moved well, did exactly what I was supposed to do, and didn't go back to the barbell too early. And then if you can get an athlete to change their thinking so they can be as focused on their rehab as they are their training or their competition day or their game day, that can be a very I think it's an underutilized weapon for some people, but it's psychology, and you got to understand what makes that person tick. And if you can get them to be super focused and locked in onto their rehab like they are their goals previously, that can be a very good chance to get them not just healed up, but maybe back on the field or the platform or whatever it may be. But that was something I had to learn on my own. Dr. McGill didn't say, hey, you need to take the same amount of effort you do for the world record and move well and do your bird dogs and your suitcase carries. He may have said that in so many words, but I had to realize that on my own. Same effort with everything you do. Do it well. Do it with, what word am I looking for? Excellence. Do it with excellence. And I think that That's the difference sometimes with working with athletes. Working with athletes can be very rewarding. It can also be a giant pain in the ass. But when this person's determined to only do their athletics or get back on the field and they're not putting effort into their recovery, that typically won't work out, like as far as a client-patient relationship with someone like me, because you can't help someone if they're not willing to do the work. So each person's unique, man, and you got to find something in them to get them to understand and buy in. My buy-in was, you got to get better before you can lift again. Okay, so I'm going to do everything I can possible to get better. That means saying no to the people moving down the street. Brian, you're a big guy. Come help me move. Sorry, not going to happen. I'm healing my back up. Brian, come lift with us. No, you know I'm rehabbing right now. You got to learn to say no to the right things and yes to the right things. And that's difficult for people. Their ego gets in the way. Use that ego for good. Ego for good. I'm going to get better no matter what. I'm going to stay on the path and I'm going to be back on the platform, but pain-free first. That's the way I looked at it.
Fantastic. And it's interesting you said that about the assessment, in not just assessing, obviously, the tissues as well, just assessing the person too. And it goes back to, makes me think about our conversation we had with Joel Proskowitz, obviously also McGill method. And he's talking about how pattern recognition starts the instant that he receives an email from the patient. It won't even be when they first come in. He's reading between the lines and trying to understand what makes the person tick. Right. So as you said, so you can know how you can get them to buy in, what you need to do. Do you need to push them? I've got, a lot of patients that are, say 3 sets of 10 and they'll say, oh, I'll do 2. Do we need to push the patient or do we need to rein them in? As you're saying, especially with athletes, I tend to see the ones where it'll be 3 sets of 10 and they're doing 6 sets of 10, right? And we've got to actually get them to understand, hey, we're being specific with this for a reason. And we like, obviously to be passionate and push forward, but at the right time and getting that buy-in. So that pattern recognition is so key to the assessment.
Yes, some people, you tell them to do 2, they'll do 4. Other people, you tell them to do 2, they'll do 1. And they're not doing enough. Those are the B types, the lethargic, not so motivated. You got to get them to do more. The type A, you got to get them to do less. So definitely you have to treat each person uniquely. And that's why a cookie cutter for 100 reasons doesn't work for people. It has to be specific to that person. And what good is a very good consult with someone for 3 or 4 hours, McGill assessment, if they're just not going to do it? You can have the most perfect program for someone that would work if they would do it. But if they're only going to do 50% of it, you got to keep that in mind that, hey, when you're talking with them, you know what they're going to do. You know that they're not going to be all in with it. They're really lethargic. You got to prepare them for a long time of not doing very much because they're just not really motivated to get better. And other people are like, man, I got this timeline. I'm going to start shooting a movie in, a couple months, or I got a meet coming up. And when they say I have a meet coming up, those are the people that automatically red flags, pattern recognition, like, meh, meh, meh. Like, what do you have going on? Oh, I have a severe herniated disc that makes my leg go dead and my glute go dead. But I still want to do the meet in 2 months. I can't help you. So sometimes I'll redirect right before we even start because of that first email. Mm-hmm. Hey, I want to get back in 2 months. Can't help you, man. Hey, I wish you the best. Absolutely. You got to let some people fail. But you do need to give them as much as you can within reason to try to prevent them from doing that. But some people, you got to let them get hurt. And then they're ready to listen because the ego is a really tough thing to deal with.
And it makes me think, as you're talking about that, also in terms of the virtual surgery, as Professor McGill calls it. And, sometimes you do need to go to that extreme with a patient and, tap them on the shoulder and say, okay, look, imagine you had surgery today. Would you be going for a 10K run tomorrow? And the simple answer is no, right? And it's quite interesting as well. I don't know if you're getting much of it in I'm sure you are in America as well, but it's become quite popular over here, at least on social media, of a specific place that does stem cells, and they're in South America. I probably get asked twice a week nowadays in clinic, oh, do you think stem cells injections would work for my back pain? And I said, well, look, again, the research, I'm not doubting the research, but it's still very early on. But maybe it's not just the stem cells, it's the fact that obviously it costs a lot of money, but they go and put you up for 2 weeks in a hotel. Everything's taken care of. You're not training. You're not doing this. You're not doing that. You're not going for your 10K runs. Maybe that forced rest that you actually have to do might actually be attributing to the progression.
Yeah. And these same people that say they feel so much better, 3 weeks later, they don't even understand that it takes months for those biological compounds to even start taking effect. It's about 3 months. Yeah. So there's a funny video of Tony Robbins, Tony Robbins, the motivational speaker, talking about how stem cells changed his life and he's going to have to quit speaking and everything. Well, a guy like that doesn't take any rest, right? The 2 weeks of rest that he took is probably what he needed to turn the corner and feel better. And then he had buy-in with the stem cells. He had a placebo effect where he thinks he's healed. He thinks that the stem cells healed his stenosis in 2 weeks. It's just like, okay, whatever you say. Sounds good. I'm glad you're feeling better. Not to mention the pain medication they're given. Exactly. They're given oral and local pain medication, maybe some lidocaine, maybe some Percocet or something like that that takes the edge off. And a lot of these people are very fixable. And I'm weary about creating fissures to put in the stem cells when someone's dealing with an annular tear already or a disc bulge or whatever it may be. That can be problematic long term. The PRP and stem cells, I've seen a lot of people get these injections and they're way worse for 6 months to a year afterward.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if you've got to spare $10,000-$15,000 to go for 2 weeks, hey, if that's what it takes, and again, like we said, that buy-in, as you said, Tony, glad feeling better, but might not be attainable for everyone else. So as we're talking about the lack of assessment, we'll put it kindly, that we see in general with GPs and neurosurgeons and specialists. Take us through to when you met Professor Stuart McGill, and obviously the very thorough initial assessment that he would have run through. What was that like, meeting Professor McGill for the first time?
Well, we spent about 5 hours together, and I went to Waterloo as a complete beginner. I'd failed so many times on my own. We've talked about the ego. My ego was kind of crushed. So I was ready to succumb to the process. Some people have to get to that point. I needed to get to that point. With that said, I went there as a complete beginner, and I humbled myself. And Dr. McGill was very adamant about me needing to quit. He said, you need to quit. If you're my son, I'd urge you to retire. After the 5-hour assessment, we went through everything from what I was doing for my rehab. We assessed my back, my hips, my walking gait, the way I moved, everything top to bottom. We lifted some, and he picked out a lot of flaws that I was causing my own pain with the way I sat, stood, moved around, all those different things. And at the end, he said, I think you can get pain-free, but you're done. He just told me straight up, you're done. I said, well, I'm going to get back to lifting when I get pain-free again. And we went back and forth. He says, all right, get pain-free. Let's see what happens. And then who knows, maybe you're right. Maybe we end up writing a book about it. And yeah, we ended up writing a book, Gift of Injury, about the process. But took 18 months, and it was a lot of downtime. It was not easy sometimes, but it was easier for me because I'd failed at so many alternative approaches. So I just succumbed to the process. And if it was going to be a year, it was going to be a year, but I was going to be back.
And like you said, you needed to get to that point, right? Where you need to get to that, I guess, all-time low, exhaust every other option and go, okay, I have to come in. I love that sort of mindset, as you said, a beginner, and by no means are you a beginner, obviously, with all that you've accomplished up to that point. But having that mindset and having that, I guess, being humble enough to say, okay, let me give this a thorough crack, trust the process, and actually take the advice and give it the time that it requires. Fascinating. And so with that, if you don't mind sharing, what were your main mechanisms? Obviously, we have the end plate fracture and all that, but for people who may not understand the McGill method as such, what were your main mechanisms or pain generators you were dealing with at that time?
definitely flexion and compression, extension, rotation. Pretty much I could stand pain-free, but if I went to do anything, it caused me pain. Standing for too long, compression would cause me pain. Sitting for too long, but once I straightened out my standing posture, went to neutral, my seated posture, started to use my hips to lower myself to the floor, didn't flop around onto the seat, onto the ground, I realized that I actually had pain-free capacity. I just didn't know how to tap into it because my movement was so polluted due to the pain. My engrams were polluted and I was lazy and sloppy.
Wow, yeah. And I think it's again, the beauty of what you do and what Professor McGill does so well is show people that you can actually have capacity if you move more efficiently, right? And I'm thinking about, I had a patient yesterday who, won't go into too much detail, but got spondylolisthesis and told the only option is surgery. And she hadn't been able to do any form of exercise for 2 years and with debilitating pain. And she was nervous to get onto the floor, right? Because she hadn't, and she knows that that was causing pain. And then, showing her the simple techniques, which you and I both know, and stiffen up a little bit where appropriate, hinge from the hips, get down to the split squat. And I think that's why this is so beautiful in terms of it shows patients and gets them that buy-in to go, okay, I do actually have some control over my pain. And I think it's such an important part of getting that buy-in for patients to actually, be able to show them that. And then they can actually trust the process and go, okay, well, this makes sense and I'm moving more efficiently without pain, and let's continue to build from there.
Yeah, once you show someone they can do some things without pain, then as they heal up, they see they can do more and more and more. But the key is making sure that they understand that just because you feel better or you can do some things pain-free, or you've been pain-free for 2 weeks, you're not healed. That disc bulge or end plate could be healing for years to come. And if you cross the tipping point, if you run ahead of the rate of repair, you can get back to an acute flare-up pretty quickly. And that's where a lot of people miss it. They get the desensitization, they get moving around the pain with strategic movement strategies, stiffening the lats and pecs, abdominal brace, use the hips in a hip hinge, split squat, rolling over, log roll, all that stuff. But then they think that after a couple of weeks of no pain, they're ready to go back and do all the things they did, move poorly again. And that's where we lose some people sometimes. They get better, they have a nasty acute flare up, and then they're off to surgery or they abandon the process. And that's unfortunate. And that's something that I had to understand, that pain-free doesn't mean healed. And that's where a lot of people, I think that's where a lot of the rub is right now with back rehab, back health, back surgery, all those things in general. People don't take into account how long it takes for the tissue to actually adapt and heal. They just, I tried, rehab for 6 weeks and I need to go to surgery. It's like, well, hold on a second. There's a lot of different, what symptoms are you having? Is your leg dead and you can't walk? You can't hold your bladder? Or is it just you're having some local back pain after 6 weeks? Like, there's a big difference there, right?
Oh, massively. Absolutely. And again, it's such an important part of educating the person, right? And getting them to understand it. Because as we were speaking about it, getting the patient to understand what they're dealing with in terms of, the mechanisms, the pain triggers, the movements, but understanding the whole context of as well. As you're saying, it's not just, okay, do, simple back stretch and then your back pain's gone. I'm sure you wish as well. My job would be very simple. All right, your back hurts, do the stretch. There you go. You're all good. Thank you. See you later. And it's so much more complex with that. And again, the more you can educate the patient, the more that they can be empowered to actually continue to improve and continue to build capacity. And it's such an important part. And I think so nicely for you to highlight that there, that it's not just about, winding down the pain. We've also got to build up and build the capacity. And it's a lifelong thing, right? You've got a spine for your life. You better treat that spine well for the rest of your life.
How long do I need to move this way? Is a common question we get, right? How long do I need to sip some air, stiffen the obliques, drop, step back, lunge to the floor, log roll, do my exercises, reverse engineer all that, come back up? I don't know. I don't know how long you need to do that, but you need to do that for the foreseeable future. And if you want to feel good, why not move like this? Because it's better on your body. Use your hips and your knees instead of your back.
Absolutely. So once you've gone through that thorough assessment, obviously that would have been very eye-opening to say the least with Professor McGill, and finding those movement tools that you can use and all that. What did your initial phase of rehab look like? What are the early days of rehab for you after the thorough assessment with McGill?
I have it here in my file drawer, but it was very basic. Do the McGill Big Three, virtual surgery first, McGill Big Three, walking, avoiding my pain triggers, compression with flexion, extension, rotation, just keeping a neutral spine, let everything cool off for a couple weeks, and then build up my walks, build up my core work, start off with the back mechanics, 6-4-2, then go to twice a day, maybe 6-4-2 in the mid-morning, and then in the evening, maybe I do a 5-2 or a 5-3. Build that up over time. I feel good, build more resilience. Then maybe we started some body weight squats, and then maybe some loaded hinges just a little bit once the pain was wound down. But initially, it was no load. It was just the big three, maybe some clamshells, lots of walking. And when I cooled down, my pain wound down pretty quick because I was such a habitual offender of my triggers. I let them cool off, the neurology cool off, and I felt considerably better just within a couple of days to weeks. And then that helped me buy in. And then for the next few months, I started to do a little bit of suitcase carries with the every 5 days, the bone scaffolding. And then from there, it was some goblet squats. And then I started feeling more and more resilient. And then we started doing a little bit of load after about 4 or 5 months. But when I started with the barbell again, it was just with the bar. 55 or 65 pounds is all I went with. Now, a big mistake that I see people do, hit on this a minute ago, they're pain-free and they go right back to the bar. You got to have that second phase to build out and flesh out your pain-free capacity. So let's say in phase one, you're doing your big three, you're walking, your virtual surgery, you're desensitizing for however long, few weeks, few months. And then the second phase, you want to build more capacity. It might be suitcase carries. It might be goblet squats. It might be, variations of push-ups and pull-ups. The problem is people don't flesh that out long enough and they go right back to the barbell. They don't have time where they're doing goblet squats, single arm stuff, single leg stuff. And they feel good for a couple of weeks and then they tweak themselves on the barbell squat after going to 50% after 2 weeks of squatting. Now, I made sure that I slowly went up the bar, then a bar and some quarters, then bar and plates, then plate and a quarter, and really took 3 or 4 months of that phase to build up and start loading again. And then once a week, I did it and then I rested. Once a week, rest, and then built more capacity on those discs, on that bone. And I was pretty pain-free and resilient after just a few months.
Wow. Incredible. And what I find most fascinating about that, as you said, having that trust in the process, but if I'm not mistaken, I remember reading in one of the chapters when you're talking about the goblet squats and saying how it was with your lightest kettlebell, 12 kgs, if I'm not mistaken. And for the listeners out there, to put it in perspective, you were squatting 1,200 pounds a couple of months before that. So having the humility and having the self-control, for lack of a better word, to actually, know that, okay, I've got to squat with 12 kgs when I've just squatted 1,200 pounds a couple of months before. That's incredible.
Yeah, but like I said, I didn't let that ego resurrect. The ego that's helped me squat the 11, 12, and 1,300 pounds that was dormant, I had to stick with the process because I'd failed so much on my own. What I was doing was working, and I didn't want to break protocol. And yeah, it's hard. It was hard on the ego, but I built more momentum and got this snowball going in the right direction versus before it was going in the wrong direction. So I built that momentum and just was bought in completely.
Fantastic. And it's saying trust the process. And from a more personal point of view, from my person in terms of just interest, were you doing many kettlebell carries or things like that before you did the rehab, before you had the injury?
No. I was doing the typical weighted reverse hypers, the swinging into a compression and extension, and then a little flexion underneath. And I couldn't understand why my back wasn't feeling better. Well, knowing now what my mechanisms of injury was,
It's such an interesting point. That's why I wanted to touch on it, because, building capacity through the various planes of movement, right? And I deal with quite a few powerlifters and strong, very strong men and women. And the fascinating thing to me is that the bar's up and down, right? In terms of, you look at your squats, your deadlift, your bench, you're moving the bar in one plane of movement, up and down. And it reminds me of a powerlifter I'm working with at the moment who's fantastic, and he's done some great rehab. And this is somebody who can lift very, very heavy, obviously not as heavy as yourself, but lift very, very heavy. And getting him to do a bird dog a side plank on his knees, that took a long, long time to develop, just body weight. Because of that plane of movement, he doesn't work out on that plane of movement. Everything's up and down. And it's quite fascinating to see that such a big disparity between being super strong in that one type of movement, but not having that capacity in the other type of movement. And again, if we see in the research, a lot of the times injuries occur when you have that bar on your rack and you're racking out, right? You're taking a step forward, you're taking a step back. It's not in the lift as much as people think. It's more in those little movements. So do you think that building that all-round capacity was so key to your basically journey back from the injury?
For sure. And the big three is the starting point for that. When we go big three, you've got the posterior, you're working a little bit more, the posterior trunk with the bird dog, the lateral core, right, with the side plank. And a lot of power lifters have no lateral endurance, no lateral core endurance, and they're shaking like a paint mixer. They 800-pound squatters and knee wraps, and they can't do a side plank, number one, pain-free, or two, effectively. But after time, you let the neurology cool down. You teach them how to stiffen properly, because they don't know how to stiffen. They just think bracing. Go brace. Well, what the hell does bracing mean? Well, it depends on who you ask. Some people will say, draw your belly button in and put it on your spine. That's not the way I would teach it, right? So we think of bracing the trunk musculature as a whole. Once you teach someone how to do that, they can unleash a lot more power under the bar. They can get rid of their micro movements and their pain generators. And they just become a whole lot better in their movement daily and with their lifts. But they've got to be hungry enough to want to regress and learn. Like power lifters, since we're talking about them, a lot of them don't want to break tradition. They think that the bent over rope crunches and reverse hypers and all this bendy, twisty stuff is going to help them build a big squat and deadlift, where they can build more trunk strength for sure, but they're going to wear out their discs. And that's not the way you lift anyway. You lift in a neutral spine, and you should try to train in a neutral spine, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to efficiency, as you're saying. I mean, there's no mistake that we've got ball and socket joints either side of our spine, right? Just by pure design, ball and socket joints are meant to move and meant to be powerful through movement. Spine is not a ball and socket joint. So as you're saying, and again, obviously we know a bit more but probably a bit biased with that, but lifting that neutral spine. And again, if you take a look at the top powerlifters or top, strong men, strong women, when they're doing their lifts, yes, there might be a slight rounding, but they're locking it in, right? It's not moving. The spine's not moving under load. And then it's so counterintuitive that then you go and train the exact opposite, as you're saying, which again, people don't realize, and they're constantly picking at their scab. And again, it goes back to the education on, hey, look, this is what's going on. This is how the tissues react to certain movements and certain postures and certain loads. And so building capacity might not look like X, Y, and Z. It might not be as, I guess, tiring as people will want, especially, everyone's chasing that burn, want to feel the muscles burning. And that's where I like to term it to patients. We're dealing with rehab, right? We're not dealing with your utmost performance in training. Those are two different things. Sure, might training, you want to be chasing those sort of things, and performance as well. That's where you can sort of break the threshold. But when we're dealing with rehab, you've got to keep that money in the bank. And it's so important to understand that, as you're saying.
I don't see a reason to be doing a bunch of bend and twist stuff if you're trying to be a rigid power lifter that doesn't bend and twist with your competition day exercises. So that's one of the arguments that I'll push back with when people say that, this is what I do for my core, my back hurts. And I'll just say, well, when you ever use that position? Well, then they'll say, well, what happens if I miss a lift or get out of position? I want to be able to correct it. Well, the best way to do that is avoid the position and use a hip or ankle strategy on the squat and move forward and underneath instead of hinging at the thoracolumbar or whatever it may be to try to muscle it up. No, you get back under the bar with your hips and stand up with it. You don't try to correct that with moving your back and trying to muscle it up. That's where we see those end plates go and the discs explode.
Yeah, absolutely.
When they're moving like that.
So once you've started, as you said, initial rehab and you gave it the due diligence that it required and the amount of time, and then you moved on to the next phase, started to build capacity. I know we touched on it before about the bone callousing, but specifically, what did that sort of look like in regards to your training? So as you said, started with the big three, building from there, some suitcase carries, respecting the tipping point, and then when you started to get back with the barbell, what did that look like?
Just once a week, I would do either a squat or a deadlift, do a couple repetitions with it, the bar and a plate, bar and a quarter plate, and then just slowly worked up. Every 3 or 4 weeks, I wouldn't load at all. So I still minded my capacity. Every 5 days, I gave it 7 days. And then I would repeat. Sometimes I'd alternate a squat on day 1, and then day 14, I'd do a deadlift, and then I'd do a squat. I wouldn't always do it every week either. So I gave myself at least a week in between a squat or a deadlift and slowly just progressive overload. But every 3 or 4 weeks, I would do none of it and just go back to the basics. Suitcase carries, core work, goblet squats, clamshells, glute bridges, hip airplanes, and then just let everything cool down for a bit. And then I noticed when I came back to it, I'd feel even better. The things that needed to be tighter and stiffer in my core were stiffer. But the things that needed to be looser, like my hips, from the neurology being pissed off for years, that cooled off, had a little more hip mobility, so I could access that some. So I just noticed that slow and steady was the way to go. And if in doubt, I took the day off. That's one big key thing. People think that they have to be so rigid. I can't take a day off. It's going to impede my healing. It's going to slow me down. Well, it may, or it may, be exactly what you need.
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating. And again, that's why it goes back to understanding, what we're dealing with, where the person is, where the patient is on their rehab journey, and specifically if you're in that wind down initial phase, less is more, right? And that's what it comes down to. And then as you're starting to build, we're starting to go through, and then again, it goes back to educating so people can understand when it's appropriate to push and when it's not appropriate to push. And it's such a key part. So from there, how long, just so the listeners have a bit of perspective, how long did that phase take where you started to build capacity and slowly started with, block pulls, very lightweight and barbell squats only? How long did that take before you started to get some decent weight on the bar?
I fleshed it out over about 3 or 4 months. And after a while, I was, approaching like 50, 60, 70% of my best again. And that's when I really started to slow down and go to singles. But one key is, as the weight went up, I eliminated the repetitions so I could do it perfectly. I would just do more singles at that weight, less rest. But one issue that people run into, and something that I see, is I didn't abandon all those things that helped me get better. I still moved well. I still did my core work every day. I still did my walks. I still did my former program. I mentioned the phase 1, 2, and 3. Phase 1 is desensitizing. Phase 2 is fleshing out that pain-free capacity. Phase 3 is getting back to whatever it is that you do, jiu-jitsu or powerlifting or whatever. But I just moved the phase 2 stuff to my warm-up. So the goblet squats, the suitcase carries, I kept them in, but I just built on top of that with the barbell squat or with the block pulls. And I just minded my capacity. I didn't just say, okay, I'm too good for that stuff now. You're never too good for these little exercises. And that's something that people do. I don't do the big three anymore. I don't walk anymore. I stopped moving well. Why? Oh, because my back didn't hurt. Well, your back hurts now. Again, go back to what we did to get you pain-free 6 months ago. Oh, man, I didn't know it worked like that. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, the way you're saying that, it reminds me of speaking to Andrew Locke, who I know you know of, and a mutual friend, and he's one of the ones I like saying is, "Did I tell you to stop? No. Well, then don't stop.
Yes.
You keep going until I tell you different." And it's such a big part of earning the right, as we like to say. You know, you doing the right things day in and day out to build capacity so you can do those other things, so you can get back to lifting, so you can get back to running. And you've got to earn the right, much like brushing your teeth. You brush your teeth twice a day, every day. You do that to earn the right to have good teeth, and you got to do the same thing. You got to earn the right to have, be performing those different activities. And it's such an important part.
Yeah, people... they get bent a little bit and upset that it's not fair that I just was doing the laundry and I blew my back out, or I was changing the dog food bowl and I blew my, I don't know what to say to that. Life really isn't fair. It's not fair that I have to move like a robot forever, is what some say. And it's like, hold on. Well, first, you'll be able to flow with this. If you watch me move in my videos, I'm not robotic at all. I can flow, and I'm a big dude. There's no reason why you being half my body weight where you can't flow and move well, but it's got to be an engram, and you got to make it automatic default no matter what you're doing. And it takes time to do this. But if you really want it bad enough, you'll do it. If you don't want it bad enough, then you'll continue to complain and say how life isn't fair.
Yeah, and as Professor Stu McGill puts it, tongue in cheek sometimes, and enjoy your pain, right? Because if you're not taking the time to actually address it and putting it a priority, as you're saying, then hey, we know what's generating your pain. It's the way you move, and if you're not taking the time to actually address that, then unfortunately you're going to be stuck with that pain. So might as well enjoy it.
Enjoy your injury. You deserve it. Yeah. Enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly.
No, you're right. It's a tough thing sometimes, and some people, you have the same talk with them over and over and over, and they've got to earn that right to lift again. And some people think they're entitled to unlimited athleticism. I don't know where they got that thought from, but you also have the other school of thought that you can do anything you want, just it's all in your head. You don't have damage, and it's just really bizarre.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, it's a real, as you can probably tell, it's a real pet peeve of mine, because it's very highly pushed here. I think, without, going in a soapbox, but I think it's because there's been a lot of research done in Australia, in particular, in this field, and it's being pushed really heavily at universities as well. And again, as we're describing, I mean, anybody listening can go back to the beginning, talking about we're not just a piece of meat attached to bone. So we understand the whole biopsychosocial approach. Don't get us wrong. And I think that's where sometimes people misquote. But understanding that the body and tissues have a certain capacity, right? And that's not whether I've got an opinion on it or not. That's true, and it's physics. And so understanding that, and moving how you want and lift how you want, and all those different technique matters. At the end of the day, technique matters.
And for some people, it matters more than others. Some people can get away with doing whatever they want. They can get back under the bar in 3 weeks and be good. Most people are not that freak, and with the whole biosocial psychological model, it was never intended to supersede the physiology. It was supposed to coexist with it. And a lot of zealots have just made it be the end all be all only thing that matters, and that was never its intent for the research years ago. It's just been taken over, and it's like physiology doesn't matter. And when is that ever the case in any field? True, absolutely true. Just my thoughts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you're saying, I mean, it's such an important part, and looking at back to, as you're saying, the pattern recognition, understanding the whole person, it's such an important part. But a big part of that is the biomechanics. So as you said, we shouldn't leave that out just because we're changing the ship and steering in a different direction completely. And again, like with most things, it's never black or white. It's always gray. So getting back to, as you were talking about the performance, I could speak about that whole topic for hours. But when you started to get into the singles, as you were saying, and really working on, promoting those healthy or efficient engrams, the movement patterns, when did you, again, to take the listeners through, what point did you start to go, okay, I think I can have a crack at the record. I'm feeling like I can actually start to push some real heavy weight again.
I became confident once my pain started to go away that I'd be back. So a few months in, I started to buy in, but really, to fast forward a little bit, I needed longer than a year to flesh out all of the little ins and outs of the process. Less than a year later, I went back to the Arnold 2014, and my back kind of flared up on me a little bit during the meet. And I had to pull out and only pull a token deadlift, and that hurt. But it really helped me calibrate my trajectory a bit. And I realized that I had a little bit too much daily compression with being too heavy. So I dropped 30 pounds of body weight after failing at the Arnold. Dr. McGill and I talked about some things. And dropping that weight and building a little bit more core endurance and capacity throughout the day allowed me over the next 6 months to be able to make it through the meet and hit all-time PRs during that time. So I needed a total of about 18 months to really go from point A to point Z. But really, point Z played itself out over the next 7 years, because the success after 18 months was only the first start, the start of the comeback. So I won the Arnold a couple more times. I went up a weight class, went down a weight class, and then finally arrived 7.5 years later, after seeing Dr. McGill that first time, and went out was setting the biggest squat of all time with 1306. And really, truth be known, full disclosure, when I wanted to come back, I just wanted to get to a 1200 squat, because that was like the 1185. I want to break 1200 and I'll be good. Never did I have the intent to hit the biggest squat of all time, regardless of weight class, or to even break more than 1200. So that was just like icing on the cake. I never really had plans for that. But once I did that, I knew probably time to shut it down. It's not going to get any better than this. Let's go out on a high note. Time to move to phase 2.
And it's so nice to hear you say that in terms of going out on your terms, right? When you wanted to, rather than being forced to because of injuries or whatever else may be the case. So as we were discussing there, building the capacity and doing the right things and earning the right to lift that heavy weight, and being able to go out on a high and pull the plug when you did. And then, as you said, moving on to the next phase of the life and realizing that there's more beyond just powerlifting, which is, again, changing that mindset into tunnel vision and looking at using that same, I guess, strong-minded, will-minded focus on different parts as well. So from there, obviously, as we're talking about, I really highly recommend people go and purchase the book. It's a fantastic read, it really is. But what is life nowadays post your powerlifting career? What does your day-to-day look like? I know we spoke a little bit about how you're helping patients. What does your day-to-day look like at the moment?
Well, it's hard to be motivated to train after competing for 20 years. So I make myself go train. I do my core work still. I go for my walks every day. I'm trying to detune the system a bit over the last 3 years. I'm still pain-free. Thankfully, I've been pain-free for the majority of the last 10 years after seeing Stu, except for the flare-up in 2014. But my day-to-day is spending time with my 3-year-olds. We want to have more kids. I'm a little older. I'm 42, but my wife's 35. So the day-to-day is helping people, seeing people in person and virtually, and spending time with my family and writing and putting content out. And I've kind of replaced the competition aspect of my life with living vicariously through my athletes and helping them and traveling with them to competitions and such. So it's better on my body that way.
A little bit more sustainable from that end, yeah. And do you think, we spoke about it, not specifically as upfront as I'm going to ask the question now, but do you think that having that background in your journey helps you help those type of patients, and particularly with the powerlifters, being yourself, how involved you are with really top athletes at the moment, and I know you do a lot of great work with them. Do you think that insight gave you a lot of advantage?
Huge advantage. It's given me a lot of psychology too. to be able to use to help people. It's not to manipulate them. It's to, number one, okay, if I'm dealing with an alpha male, they can be difficult. I'm a type A. I deal with other type A's. I get pushback when they say, I don't want to take time off. I don't want to do A, B, C. Well, then I can fire back and say, well, Chad, Joe, Timmy, I'm never going to have you do anything that I didn't do myself. So if I'm not too good enough to do it, you're not too good enough to do it. Take some time off, heal. And also I have empathy too for the person that's struggling. Maybe they're not pushing back so hard. They're just downtrodden and beat up. I can say, I've been there where you are. It can get better, but you can't feel sorry for yourself. You've got to get up. You've got to get out of bed. Stop laying in the bed for 11 hours. Get your ass up. Go for a walk. Move well. And rebuild your athleticism. But the person that you don't want to kick them when they're down. So you got to understand, well, I know I wouldn't respond well to that when I was feeling this way. So I've been there. I have the empathy to deal with, but sometimes you got to be that motivation for them too, but you can't do that. You can't do it for them. Number one, so you got to realize that. Number two, you can't want it more than them. You can't want them to be better more than they want to be better. And you realize that sometimes that they don't want to get better. They want to bitch about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're saying, you can show them all the evidence and give them all the insights and explain the various mechanisms and everything going on. But as you said, if they don't make that switch and realize that, take accountability of it. And again, that goes back to understanding that you have control over the way you move. You have control over being in the different postures and positions and loads and training or not training. And having that accountability is so important. So it must be, great from people who work with you in terms of having that insight because you've been there and done that, right? And so I think, as you said, might not necessarily make you a better clinician, quote unquote, on paper, but having that insight, I think, does make you a better clinician because you can be empathetic in those situations. And as you said, sometimes know when you've got to, G them up a little bit and get them going, and other times where you've got to take the pressure off and say, okay, we just need a little bit more time. So I think it would, just from my perspective, would make you a much more in tune clinician, if I can put it that way.
I wouldn't be half as good without it. I can tell you that.
Absolutely.
I wouldn't be half as good. So I'm exactly where I feel very confident when I say I'm exactly where I need to be right now. And I wouldn't be in this place without the injury. And I wouldn't be nearly as sympathetic or empathetic with people complaining about their back unless I went through it myself. Mm-hmm. So it's been a great experience for me, even though it sucked at the time. I'm in a better place for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great sort of point to wrap up on. So as we do with most of our patients, to wrap up, we ask two questions. And the first one is, if you couldn't be a power lifter or had the career that you have had, what would you have wanted to do?
I don't know, man. I never really had an idea what I wanted to do when I was younger. So I just kind of still figuring it out now as I go. I would like to play in the NFL. That'd be fun. Yeah, I loved hitting people, and was never big enough. I was a pretty strong dude, but that would be cool. Hitting people and running around like that if I wasn't powerlifting. But I'm happy with the path that I took now, and probably playing the NFL. I would like to have done that.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And if you could go back, I know it's quite a big open-ended question, but if you could go back and travel in time and speak to a young Brian Carroll, perhaps in 1996 when you're playing baseball, before we got into any significant injuries or anything like that, what would be the one piece of advice? If you could only give one piece, what would be the one piece of advice you would give to a younger self?
Slow down. Take it slow. There's no rush. Do things right. Take your time, because I have a tendency to rush through things at times just because I'm a little bit hyperactive by nature. And so I would say, take your time. There's no rush, and you don't have to get everything done before you're 40.
Yes. Life does go on after 40. Absolutely.
Yep.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule. I know how much you've got going on and just finished up from Swiss as well. So I appreciate you being on the podcast. And for people listening out there, where can they follow you and find you on socials and all that? Where can they find out more about you?
Yeah, so you can find me Brian Carroll 1306 on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook. And powerrackstrength.com is my HQ for all my content and contacting me. And we just released Gift of Injury in Polish edition and Korean edition. We have Italian edition. So you can go to BackFit Pro to find all those different copies in those unique languages. But thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation. And anytime you want to do it again, just let me know. And remember out there, back pain takes time to address and wind down. It's not an automatic death sentence. And it's something that can be beat, but it has to be done the right way. And each person is going to need a unique program and recipe to get that accomplished.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. And for all the listeners out there, everyone viewing, again, saying it, but highly recommend checking out The Gift of Injury. It's a fantastic read. And even if you're not interested in the area of powerlifting, there's some real good insights into more than that. And there's some great insight into the journey that you've come through. So again, thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate you being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, bud.